A thematic essay on the political satire in Gulliver's Travels. In Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift presents one of the most unrelenting political satires in English literature. Writing in the early 18th century, an era marked by the decline of divine right monarchy, the rise of parliamentary politics, and the uneasy birth of modern liberalism, Swift turned his pen against the pieties of his age. He wrote not to praise progress, but to interrogate its foundations. Against the backdrop of Whig triumphalism and Tory collapse, he dismantled Enlightenment optimism with scorn, parody, and surgical wit. As an Anglican clergyman in Ireland, a colonial outpost of British power, Swift was intimately familiar with the hypocrisies of empire, religion, and political rhetoric. His allegiance to the church and his complex position within the British system gave him a uniquely bitter vantage point. He was not disillusioned because he once believed too little, but because he once believed too much. Disgusted by both Whigs and Tories, Swift judged politics not through ideology, but through ethics. What matters was not doctrine, but decency. And in the real world, he saw little of either. Gulliver's Travels is not a call to action. It is a warning disguised as a farce. Through grotesque exaggeration, biting irony, and moral inversion, Swift exposes the machinery of political life, how language cloaks violence, how office rewards cunning rather than virtue, and how institutions, be they monarchies, parliaments, or academies, sustain themselves through illusion and inertia. From the petty court rituals of Lilliput to the unmoored theorists of Laputa and the cold-blooded reason of the Houyhnhnms, Swift builds a satirical cartography of political failure. This essay will explore how Gulliver's Travels deconstructs politics by revealing the absurd, theatrical, and often brutal mechanisms by which power is maintained and justified. The Rope Dancers. Swift introduces a curious court entertainment in Lilliput, a performance exclusively for the Emperor, Empress, and First Minister, staged only on special occasions. This is no innocent sport. It's a metaphor for political advancement, where offices are won not by merit but by sycophantic performance. The visual comedy of nobles leaping over threads satirizes the real-life absurdities of court politics, where loyalty to power trumps competence. To gain and maintain office, politicians have to endure absurd and humiliating lengths for attention. Swift drives the point home in another passage. The stick is more than just a prop. It symbolizes the arbitrary will of those in power. Success depends not on skill or integrity, but on the ability to accommodate shifting whims. Under George I, Swift saw this in figures like Sir Robert Walpole, who rose through flattery and not statesmanship. Think of the way Stalin's inner circle had to continually prove loyalty, often through ritualistic acts of deference, even when they knew it would cost them their lives, or the rigid, ritualized displays of loyalty toward the Kim family in North Korea. As political theatre, the rope dance is grotesque and faintly ridiculous, but that's the point. It's a grotesque mirror of a system where posturing, and not principle, secures promotion. The scene also showcases Swift's hallmark deadpan irony. Gulliver reports these spectacles with calm admiration, never betraying the absurdity. This straight-faced narration is a key feature of Swift's satire. It forces us to read between the lines, heightening the mockery. Literary critic Arthur Case observed that Swift's satire works not by overt derision, but by heightened realism, pushed into the grotesque. The rope dances aren't fantasy. They're caricatures of real courtiers. Their sycophancy is simply exaggerated into farce. Modern leaders surround themselves with loyalists and not experts. Consider appointments based in loyalty in Trump's administration, or sycophancy in authoritarian regimes like Erdogan's Turkey or Modi's India. Tramixan versus Slamixan. Swift's portrayal of the Tramixan and Slamixan, the high heels and the low heels, serves as a deft and incisive allegory for the entrenched factionalism that plagued early 18th century British politics. These two rival parties embody the profound ideological divide between the Tories and the Whigs, reflecting competing visions of monarchy, religion, and governance. The high heels, Tramixan, stand for the Tories, staunch defenders of the Anglican Church, the monarchy, and traditional hierarchical values. In stark contrast, the low heels, Slamixan, symbolize the Whigs, champions of parliamentary supremacy, commercial interests, and a more expansive religious tolerance, particularly towards Protestant dissenters who at the time were excluded from the established church. The political reality of the time is mirrored in the king's reliance on the low heels, This is an explicit nod to the Whig ascendancy under George I, whose reign Swift loves to critique unflinchingly. The metaphor is sharp. The emperor's mismatched heels don't just signal indecision, they expose how hollow and theatrical politics has become. The monarch, though privately favouring the Tories, must rely on the Whigs to maintain power. And so he has a hobble, which becomes a physical expression of a politically crippled regime. This directly reflects King George I's own predicament. A German-speaking monarch with Tory leanings, he nonetheless depended on Whig ministers, particularly Robert Walpole, who soon became the most powerful political figure in Britain. Swift knew his audience would see straight through the Lilliputian allegory. But he goes further. Behind the pageantry, the real decisions are made out of sight. This hidden council, small, exclusive, partisan, it exposes where real power lies. It's not in public deliberation, but in closed rooms dominated by party insiders. Swift's criticism is clear. Political merit has been displaced by loyalty, secrecy, and strategic conformity. Many modern nations are plagued by tribalism on the basis of ethnicity. Electoral factionalism splits populations along ethnic lines, where identity is everything, and the prosperity of the whole country is secondary to this. What's most cutting here is the absurdity of the dispute itself. The height of your heels becomes a stand-in for ideology, reminding us that party politics often drifts into stylized tribalism. The emperor's compromise isn't statesmanship but survival. Political identity is costume. One is reminded of red-blue factionalism, where hat colors or pronoun usage signal allegiance more than policy does. This is classic comic inversion, elevating trivial differences to deadly seriousness. And by doing this, Swift punctures the idea that political divisions are always grounded in principle. As the critic Pat Rogers puts it, Swift makes us laugh at the dangers of dogma by showing us how petty its markers can be. The Emperor's Clemency. In a passage from Gulliver's account of the Lilliputian court, where the emperor's public speeches follow acts of cruelty, Swift warns us against dictators with sweet tongues. How kind of the emperor to murder gently. Swift exposes the propaganda tactic of tyrants, dressing violence in the language of virtue. The irony is sharp. What should be reassuring, a speech on mercy, becomes a warning sign to the people that something horrific has just occurred. Swift skewers a common political performance, the ruler who praises his own clemency just after committing brutality. His satire targets not only hypocrisy but the manipulation of public perception, where moral language becomes a weapon of control. There is no contradiction for such leaders between cruelty and virtue, because their notion of morality is purely rhetorical. This anticipates Orwellian doublethink, where contradictory truths are believed simultaneously, and where tyranny is justified through the language of compassion. As Irvin notes, Swift often shows not just hypocrisy but also self-deception. Those in power convince themselves of their benevolence because power distorts both conscience and reality. We see historical parallels in many regimes. During the French Reign of Terror, the Committee of Public Safety carried out executions in the name of justice and virtue. In Stalinist Russia, purges were conducted as acts of protection and progress. More recently, governments worldwide have used the language of human rights or national security to veil extrajudicial killings, state surveillance, or ethnic oppression. One is immediately reminded of El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele, who garnered international acclaim by declaring days with zero homicides in the wake of a crackdown that saw over 85,000 people arrested under a prolonged state of exception. Prominent political figures and media outlets celebrated his apparent success in reducing crime. However, human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Christocell have denounced the mass detentions as arbitrary because they often target innocent civilians and don't give them due process. Critics emphasize that Bukele has systematically dismantled democratic institutions. He has removed independent judges, curtailed press freedom, and targeted civil society groups. This has prompted widespread concern that the celebrated drop in crime comes at the expense of civil liberties and authoritarian consolidation. These echoes suggest that Swift is diagnosing a political habit that is deeper than any single era, the transformation of virtue into performance. The more absolute the power, the more theatrical its displays of morality, and the more suspicious we should be of leaders who feel the need to declare insistently that they are good. This passage also taps into an enduring theme in Swift's writing: the moral distortion caused by unchecked authority. The more absolute the power, the more performative its virtue. In Gulliver's Travels, the episode in Brobdingnag provides a revealing counterpoint to the political culture of the modern world. When Gulliver attempts to explain the notion of state secrecy to the Brobdingnagian king, the monarch is baffled. This confusion is telling. For the king, the idea that a government might withhold information from its own people, absent an external threat, is absurd. Transparency is a baseline moral expectation, not a political strategy. Swift uses this moment to satirize the perverse logic of modern governance, where citizens are treated not as partners in a social contract, but as potential adversaries. In many contemporary democracies, governments operate behind closed doors even in matters that directly affect the public, citing vague notions of security or pragmatism. Such secrecy breeds suspicion, and the result isn't protection, it is mistrust. In the United Kingdom, the Official Secrets Act has long given British intelligence and the executive branch power to withhold information, even in peacetime, ostensibly to protect national interests. Critics argue that this has enabled cover-ups, for example, the Iraq War intelligence manipulation and surveillance abuses. The institutionalization of secrecy, even where no war or foreign threat exists, echoes the king's puzzlement. Why should the government be opaque when there is no enemy at hand? In the United States, in the 1960s and 70s, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the US government misled the public about the Vietnam War's progress and aims. Successive administrations knew that the war was unwinnable, but they concealed this for political reasons. This secrecy created a massive rift between government and citizens. The post-9/11 US surveillance state serves as an even better paragon. After 9/11, programs like PRISM and others, revealed by Edward Snowden, showed that the US government, particularly the NSA, had engaged in mass surveillance of its own citizens, collecting phone records, emails, and metadata without public knowledge or meaningful oversight. The king's reaction holds up a moral mirror to modern statecraft. What Gulliver sees as clever diplomacy, that is, opaque bureaucracy and strategic misinformation, the king regards as dishonest and primitive. Swift doesn't mock the Brobdingnagian court. He elevates it as a foil, exposing the ethical decay of modern politics. Literary scholar Paul Alcon calls Brobdingnag Swift's model of rational monarchy, not because it's utopian, but because it makes the modern world's political dysfunction much more legible by contrast. The Political Projectors. In the Academy of Political Projectors, which is an institution in the floating island of Laputa where abstract science dominates practical affairs, Swift presents a cruel irony. Ideas such as rewarding merit, consulting the public good, and appointing ministers based on wisdom are considered laughably unrealistic. Gulliver, ever the naive observer, is confused that anyone would propose such ideals. Swift satirizes not vice, but here a political culture that is so corrupt that virtue itself appears absurd. If we find these suggestions naive, it is not because the ideals are flawed, but because we've grown accustomed to a world where integrity in public life is unimaginable. The passage stings because its irony is so barefaced. Swift presents the noblest political virtues as the delusions of madmen. What should be common sense, that is, appointing ministers based on wisdom, rewarding merit, it is treated instead not just as unworkable, but comically unhinged. His satire forces the reader into a double take. Have we sunk so far that sanity sounds like madness? This ironic dissonance is intentional. Gulliver's casual dismissal mirrors the reader's possible instinctive reaction, and yet Swift hopes to shame us with it. These chimeras were once Enlightenment ideals, and now they seem laughable. Swift's pessimism is clear. Not that virtue is difficult, but that a corrupt system makes it unthinkable. In Orwell's Animal Farm, he explores how revolutionary ideals decay once power has been seized. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This famous phrase captures the same moral erosion that Swift fears. And Machiavelli's The Prince, though often read cynically, presents a grim realism. A ruler, concerned with survival, cannot afford to be ruled by virtue. Swift doesn't advocate or advise abandoning morality, but he warns that in politics, even imagining virtue may become absurd. We see the same despair in Swift's political essays, by the way. In The Examiner, he mocked the party system as a circus where self-interest devours principle. The Academy, then, is no mere joke. It's a grim verdict on public life. Not that it fails to embody virtue, but that public life cannot even imagine virtue. Political medicine. In The Academy of Political Projectors, Swift reaches a peak of farce with a series of grotesquely literal reforms for fixing broken government. He describes a satirical proposal in which physicians attend the Senate, diagnose each senator like a patient, and then prescribe physical treatments, lenitives, aperitives, abstersives, and acoustics to correct their temperaments and improve their legislative performance. The sheer ridiculousness is the point. Swift's parody of medical intervention becomes a metaphor for political dysfunction so profound that it requires purging, not debating. This is satire by inversion. Absurd problems deserve absurd solutions. As the wise man said in Proverbs, "Answer a fool according to his folly." But the underlying criticism is surgical. Senators are not healed but disciplined, silenced, stirred, shut up, or jolted into usefulness. Deliberation is treated like disease. Swift doubles down on grotesque comedy with an even more violent proposal. Ministers who are plagued by forgetfulness should be kicked, pinched, or stabbed with pins by citizens until they remember their obligations. It is a brutal fantasy of accountability in a world where public servants routinely forget the very public they are meant to serve. These scenes are cartoonish, yes, but they carry a sting. If politicians are numb to the needs of the people, then Swift implies the people must get physical. What makes it funny is also what makes it damning. The final blow comes in the proposal that senators be forced to vote the opposite of their spoken arguments. This is Swift's most outrageous moment, comedy verging on surrealism. But it's also one of his most precise critiques. The absurdity is intentional because it matches the absurdity of the problem. This is classic Swiftian inversion, treating absurd problems with absurd solutions in order to show just how far from reason the system has drifted. The proposals are grotesque, but they are no more irrational than the dysfunction that they mock. George Orwell, writing on Swift, said, "He is not a man out to reform the world. He is a man who knows it cannot be reformed and wants to shock you into seeing why." So these medicines that Swift proposes are grotesque because the disease, corrupt politics, is grotesque itself. Gulliver's Travels can be read as a dark answer sheet to the central questions of political philosophy. What is government for? To maintain illusions. Who should rule? Whoever can flatter and deceive the most skillfully. Can politics be virtuous? Not in a world where merit is punished and sycophancy is rewarded. Truth, justice, and reason are not absent in Swift's political world. They are actively mocked, censored, and sidelined. Rather than propose reforms, Swift tears down every foundational myth of statehood. His satire leaves us not with solutions, but with uncomfortable clarity. The problem is not one party or policy, but the nature of politics, and perhaps of man himself. Across the 4 voyages, Swift does not merely parody individuals or transient policies, he probes the structural and psychological deformities of political life itself. He reveals a world in which virtue is powerless, reason is weaponized, and authority is maintained not through wisdom, but through pageantry, sycophancy, and control. Political parties become exercises in tribal loyalty. Dissent becomes either criminal or irrelevant, and those who attempt to speak honestly are either punished, silenced, or mocked. Swift offers no utopia to counter this world. His satire is diagnostic, not prescriptive. He gives no model republic, no enlightened statesman, no heroic rebellion. Instead, we are left with Gulliver, first curious, then disillusioned, and finally alienated, whose journey mirrors the collapse of political faith. In this, Swift anticipates both Machiavelli's cold realism and Orwell's cynical clarity. Politics is not the realm of virtue, but of survival, and those who cling to ideals without power are either destroyed or rendered absurd. By exaggerating vice and shrinking virtue, Gulliver's Travels forces readers to see how easily public life degenerates into absurdity when power operates without conscience. That its satire remains relevant centuries later is less a testament to Swift's genius than a condemnation of politics itself. What Gulliver's Travels mocks is not some distant kingdom, but the systems, justifications, and delusions that continue to govern our own.